SWNZ, reporting on all Star Wars hobbies in New Zealand. Hey everybody, this is Matt for SWNZ Star Wars New Zealand with a video on a very unique New Zealand Star Wars collectible that I really want to take the time to walk through. Going to take a look today at the run of Star Wars comics that showed up in the New Zealand Women's Weekly between the years of 1979 and 1984. That's quite a long span, 5 years, nearly 5 years in total, starting off with the cover issue that you see right here. We've talked about these in depth on the SWNZ website with a full index of all the stories contained over the 5 years of this run, but I really wanted to take some time to walk through my complete collection and a couple of examples of what those comics actually looked like when they were in the New Zealand Women's Weekly magazines. Many of you out there will remember these fondly, and some may even have some of these in their collection. There's 262 pages in total over a span of 5 years, so it's quite a large collection and a little challenging to amass a full collection, but I mostly had an entire run from my childhood and was able to fill in the remaining 1 or 2 gaps in my later years. So I'm really quite keen to just walk through those with everybody here and see what aspects of them you particularly remember and talk about the aspects of them that I particularly enjoyed. This is a replica, a photocopy of the cover of the first magazine issue that the Star Wars comics were contained in. It's got this corner splash that shows off that a Star Wars comic is contained herein. I unfortunately don't have a copy of the full magazine. Maybe one day I'll add that to my collection, but in the meantime a friend has been able to supply a nice copy of the cover. That very first issue came with a 12-page booklet that introduced the concept of the New Zealand Star Wars comics. This started off the familiar pink border that we see on all the comics, almost all the comics later on. The pink border goes right to the edges of the pages, and it made it quite nice and easy to visualize when the pages are still in the magazine. So we'll just extract this carefully. These elderly magazines are a little bit fragile now, so I keep them stored in plastic, and you can see that that pink border is quite prominent, and although the magazine is targeted at a audience of New Zealand women, children would flick through those and jump straight to the Star Wars comic whenever they got those issues. As I mentioned, the first issue came with a 12-page booklet. It came out on the 20th of August 1979, and the story contained therein was called The Constancia Affair by Russ Manning. It introduces C-3PO talking to a large computer system, Mistress Nemos, in the Rebel Stronghold, and he's reciting stories about the heroes and villains of the original trilogy, and that's the mechanism by which we jump from story to story hereafter. So Russ Manning is responsible for the story and the artwork. Star Wars comics were quite a new concept for me at this point when they came out. I had got my hands on some of the Marvel Star Wars comics, but not a full run, and they were just starting to warm up. So it was really fantastic to see Star Wars characters in new stories in an expanded universe on such a regular basis. This first story, we see C-3PO and R2-D2 ejected into space, rescued by Han Solo and the Millennium Falcon. It was quite interesting as a child to see stories outside of the original trilogy and outside with characters from outside the original trilogy. So Han Solo and his female companion of the time are chased by advanced TIEs, similar to Darth Vader's X-1 prototype, and they make their way to a secret hidden base in an asteroid field where they catch up with characters from Han Solo's past. So it's really quite exciting to start to see an expansion of, there's two things that I found really interesting: an expansion of the existing story at that time, but also strong references back to the original trilogy. So even in this first episode of this 12-page booklet that introduces we see the Empire and Stormtroopers and so forth. Slip that back in there. So I've got quite a bit to walk through today, if you bear with me. I think It's going to be a little bit of a fun walk down memory lane for me and hopefully those in the audience that have fond memories of these. Got them all stored in these plastic sleeves. I'll just flick it ahead because I've got two versions of this first booklet. One as it was inserted in the center pages of that first issue of the magazine, and then in the individual pages as they started to come out in later issues of the New Zealand Women's Weekly. So I'll just rotate that. I know we've got a bit of a glare from the lights, but I'll just flick through these and see what sort of things we can find. The Constantia affair just continued for one issue, one page after that 12-page booklet, before we move on to a story also by Russ Manning entitled The Kashyyyk Depths. The names of each story don't necessarily show up in the pages, but these comics were derived from the newspaper comic strips in the US, and we got the full page issues that came out on the weekend in the US. We didn't get the daily narrow strips that interspersed them, so in some instances there's a little bit of a jumping between the stories. And in the US, the weekly comic strips were summarized on the weekend, and that's the version that we got in New Zealand, full page summaries of a larger story early on. So we know the names of all the stories because of the way they were printed in the US, and because subsequent to that these have all been collected up by Dark Horse Comics initially in a bundled format. They've also appeared on the Star Wars Hyperspace website when that was a thing, and more recently between 2017 and 2019 they were bundled into 3 volumes by IDW Publishing, so you can get these collected with the rest of the newspaper comics, these stories collected with all the strips in their entirety in large hardbound volumes. The Kashyyyk Depths were fascinating. They came out in 1979. The run began on 8th of October 1979, and the thing I found interesting is this is a little bit after the release of the Star Wars Holiday Special, which took place on Kashyyyk and introduced a little bit about the Wookiee culture and the Wookiee architecture seen here in the trees. So it's nice to see that continuity with a non-canon aspect of the Star Wars universe. So I won't delve into the stories in their entirety. We have captured these on a story-by-story basis on the new SWNZ website, so you can take a look at the summaries of the stories and some scans of some of these pages if you want to delve into them a little deeper in your own time. So we see a lot about the Wookiee culture and the environment of Kashyyyk outside of the Wookiee townships, the Wookiee tree villages, which again, very fascinating. We encounter sentient plant life that is being harassed by Imperials in this novel hybrid trooper type work person setup, and the vegetation strikes back. Lots of drama, lots of action, lots of motion in these comic strips. That, for something that was free in the New Zealand Women's Weekly, they were very satisfying, they were very exciting. You can see that the bottom of each page declares that the story will be continued next week. Single page comics would over in a flash as a child, not a lot to digest. But the anticipation from week to week of continuing the story was a really fun thing as a young Star Wars fan. Okay. So this end panel of this comic here, we see the movement back from the recounting of the story set on Kashyyyk to C-3PO and the Rebel Stronghold. That doesn't persist through all the comics. They kind of abandon the persistence with that as we move along. Before I move on to the next story, which was one of my favorites, it came in early, Tatooine, based on Tatooine, started in December 1979. It does in fact have the title there, Tatooine Sojourn. I'll just open up these magazines here to show an embedded comic. I said they were easy to find. Now that I'm on video, they are not going to be easy to find. They usually occurred about the middle, and they're often in association with the Cookie Bear Club of the time. I've only got a couple of examples of these that I was able to pick up, but it's fun to just see them still embedded in an actual magazine. And in conjunction with the fact that a lot of the pages, well, an amount of the pages have a date on the back, I was able to retroactively work back and create the index that we've got on the SWNZ website of all the stories relating them to the issues of the Women's Weekly magazine that they came out in. So that's one of the full issues that I have on hand. I'll slip it back into its protective sleeve, pop that out of the way. This other one here. Extract. And again, this is from the Kashyyyk Depths story arc, embedded in the middle of the magazine. Nice to have them in mint condition. So most people have them out of the magazines themselves. That's obviously where most of my collection is, and in some instances they've been punched historically and held in the folders, although now I've got them all in these plastic sleeves for protection. The stories can be read, like I say, in other formats from Marvel, Dark Horse and IDW Publishing, but it is nice to have this original Women's Weekly format for posterity and nostalgia. Okay. So I've got a couple of folders of these, and like I say, if you can bear with me, we will walk through them. I really enjoyed this story for a number of reasons. It takes Luke Skywalker, still in his farm boy outfit, back to Tatooine. I loved seeing Jawas again, but this was one of my favourite pages, one of my favourite panels, because of this monochrome flashback that's embedded into the cantina, sort of denoting that Luke is having a flashback of the original trilogy, the A New Hope events, the events of A New Hope, when he returns to his home planet of Tatooine. Okay, we've shifted fully to a horizontal format at this point. And as well as seeing Jawas, I loved seeing other aliens, robots from the, that I call it the original trilogy, but at that time we hadn't, Empire Strikes Back hadn't come out, so it was really just from Star Wars A New Hope. I loved seeing Jawas and Sand People in new stories in this expanded universe. Stormtroopers, Sandcrawlers, Banthas, Sandcrawlers moving over the surface of Tatooine and using the Sandcrawler as a weapon to infiltrate, not subtly, a Imperial stronghold on Tatooine. Again, lots of action, lots of movement, new characters, new concepts, TIE fighters, a lot of activity and enjoyment. So Russ Manning was involved in a number of the first series of comics. Russ Manning's famous for other works of working on comic titles such as Tarzan, and a slightly older title that some may be familiar with. I was actually a fan of it before even Star Wars, Magnus Robot Fighter. Russ Manning worked on the comics through to about 1980, late 1980, mid-late 1980, before he became unwell and sadly passed away in 1981. So we do start to see him working with some others before other artists and writers fully take over. We moved through stories that focused on Han Solo and Chewbacca, Luke Skywalker on Tatooine, and now Princess Leia, Imperial Servant. So Princess Leia has been ejected from a starship that was being chased by TIE fighters. She crashes on a Imperial controlled planet and has to pretend to be an Imperial servant in order to escape. And on this planet she encounters who was at that time the interpretation of Tarkin's wife or partner, Lady Tarkin, and has strong feelings about that because Grand Moff Tarkin, of course, was responsible for the destruction of Princess Leia's home planet, Alderaan. So with a bit of help from locals and a close encounter with Darth Vader, she manages to escape. So about 18 pages, 8 pages in total, no sorry, yeah, 8 pages in total for this story. After some longer stories, the Constantia Affair at 18 pages, and Kashyyyk Depths at 9 pages, we settled into about an 8-page per story arc rhythm. So that's pretty tight storytelling, with a few gaps, as I say, because of the formatting, the way we didn't get all of the material that was released in the American versions of these comics. But within that tight storytelling, we do see a lot happen and a lot of existing material referenced. The second Kessel Run, another Han Solo story. Luke Skywalker is there, the Millennium Falcon is there, the droids are there. Princess Leia is not involved in this story. I loved seeing the interpretation of stormtroopers. These comics as a kid were the sort of things I would use as templates to draw my own Star Wars adventures. And whenever I got doubles of these, they would often end up in scrapbooks, particularly, key frames, title frames. So a lot of interpretations of the material. For instance, the planet Kessel or the Kessel system have long been overwritten by modern canon, but that's fine. That's the nature of the history of Star Wars and the Star Wars expanded universe. Okay, Bring Me the Children. This ran from the 26th of May 1980 through to July 1980, so we're moved out of 1979 when the comics began into the second year. Okay, so the main heroes of the rebellion of Star Wars showing up and aiding in the, escape of oppressed people on a planet. We actually see Darth Vader, Stormtrooper variant there, exploding TIE fighters, and it was a fairly lightweight story, this one, but chases and tension and interaction between the heroes of the rebellion, and I guess it kind of gives a little bit of a taste of what was thought to be the bigger picture of the Star Wars universe at that time, other planets, how they were oppressed by the Empire and so forth. Star Wars As Long As We Live. We do have the title card on a few of the opening pages. As Long As We Live, still by Russ Manning. 8 pages with a few other artists as we go along, so there's a little bit of variation in the artwork through this particular story here. I love how characters remained in the exact or very similar versions of the costumes that they were seen in Star Wars A New Hope. But I guess, that made it recognisable. That was before a lot of development of the expanded universe, and we needed that tight connection with the familiar presentations of the characters. Now what I've got here is just a little bit of a variation. When I was young, at about this point, which is in the mid-1980s, I went to Australia with the family and was able to pick up from an Australian newspaper their version of these exact same comics. So for this story, I've actually got the New Zealand Women's Weekly, but also the same panels extracted from the Australian newspaper, which I can't remember exactly which one it was. It may show up, but I've just got them in my folder here. So just it's a little bit of a novel difference just for the story. I love panels like this, showing the action of TIE fighters and X-Wings in battle, drama, and simplified but relatively accurate interpretations of the vehicles and the characters and the hardware. Australian newspaper versions spanned. So those came out in full-sized newspaper pages, so they've blown up to nearly twice the scale of the New Zealand versions. Again, like I say, just a little bit of trivia, not related to the New Zealand Women's Weekly, but interesting at the time. The Frozen World of Otter, or Ota, depending on your preferred pronunciation, was a fantastic story, an exciting story. It features, we can just see on this panel here, not known by Luke Skywalker who first encounters them, but they encounter with Boba Fett. So, like in a similar way, in a similar vein to the presentation of Boba Fett in the animated segment of the holiday special, we see an attempt at filling out Boba Fett's backstory. He encounters, again, sorry, Australian newspaper there, encounters Luke Skywalker. Han Solo's in the mix, but they don't cross paths immediately. Luke Skywalker encounters Boba Fett and initially doesn't know that he is a bounty hunter in pursuit of Han Solo. So they are actually allied for a portion of the story before ultimately Boba Fett's intentions are revealed. But Boba Fett's a relatively simple character to draw. I loved the accuracy and the colour interpretation back in the day, and it was exciting to see such a fan favourite character showing up in these stories. And the early advertisements and sort of promotion related to Boba Fett really emphasised his array of armaments and weaponry, and this is a fun example showing his knee blasters, in this instance being automatically fired even though his hands are restrained, and we see flamethrower effects in a number of panels. Okay, this is a little bit of an oddity. It just shows something that crops up in publishing. I guess a little bit of variant. The significance here is that these are 2 pages of the same strip, one of which does not have one of the colours correctly aligned, so we end up with strong variations in the panel colour, yellows instead of reds, and a yellow border instead of a pink border. Just a little bit of a quirk there. Fun to have those 2 variants. I don't know how often that showed up, or if it showed up under any other circumstances. So that was the Frozen World of Otter, whichever. Planet of Cadrill was the last. It was written by Russ Helm, drawn by a new contributing artist, Alfredo Alcala. This initially was one of the quirks in that it wasn't included in the Dark Horse collections of the comic series, but it does show up later in the, like I say, the definitive releases from IDW Publishing. Planet of Cadrill, taken over by Darth Vader in this instance, in a similar way to the Imperial takeover of Cloud City later in some ways. See the locals, the lizard-like locals of that region. Right. Okay, now we get on to a biggie. This is Star Wars Han Solo at Star's End. Story by Brian Daley. Brian Daley was the author of the Han Solo at Star's End novel. That was the second expanded universe novel I ever encountered as a child and read. It came out shortly after Splinter of the Mind's Eye and was the start of a series of Han Solo novels. Splinter of the Mind's Eye I got out from the local library before I had my own copy and just read over and over. And similarly for Han Solo at Star's End, Splinter of the Mind's Eye features Luke Skywalker and Princess Leia. Han Solo at Star's End tells the story of Han Solo prior to A New Hope, Han Solo and Chewbacca, and it was super exciting to see the written word of the Han Solo at Star's End novel interpreted in this format. This has been collected as well as in the larger newspaper collections. It's been published as single comics from memory by Dark Horse earlier on. We get a little bit of a change. Yeah, let me just check. A little bit of a change in the formatting, in that we've moved on to sort of single wordless title panels. Sometimes sometimes the artwork relates to the story, but later on the artwork is distinct and just sort of pin-up type art. So we see Blue Max and a number of all the other characters of Han Solo, Star End. I won't go into the story in detail, but I did love this story as an expansion of the Star Wars universe back when there was very little other material to consume. It was just great seeing and hearing the difference, and like I say, the interpretation of the written word, and focusing on depth and characters and their backstories outside of the events of Star Wars A New Hope and later The Empire Strikes Back. So Han Solo at Star's End premiered in New Zealand in January of 1981. It actually ran for 18 pages. Slightly different logo from the other comics, so other comic pages, so it stands out. And as we saw, the first page of this run in New Zealand seemed to be in black and white for one reason or the other. We encountered that later on, that I guess the source material they got from the US weren't the colour versions, so they had to resort to just printing the pages in black and white. But a pivotal entry, an important entry in the New Zealand Women's Weekly Star Wars comic series, Han Solo at Star's End, and with its groovy interpreted logo. It doesn't show up anywhere else in the comic series or in the Star Wars material at all, really. So unfortunately, because of the way this comic was presented, there's a few gaps, a few jumps between the story arcs. Over 18 pages they tried to tell an adaptation of the entire novel. There are a few gaps, but most people, well, a lot of the fans, a lot of kids reading this will have already been familiar with the novel, particularly those that were obsessed at the level I was as a kid. So you sort of know to fill in the gaps, and you're just sort of using these comics as a supplement to the novel and your understanding of the novel. Alright, this is an example where the concluding page of the comic teases what's coming up next, the Bounty Hunter of Ord Mantell. Another really key, exciting story arc, because Ord Mantell, the Bounty Hunter on Ord Mantell, is an encounter that is referenced in The Empire Strikes Back. So moving on to the Bounty Hunter, moving on to the Bounty Hunter of Ord Mantell, commenced on the 11th of May 1981. This is about, well, not quite halfway through the run yet. This is about page 102 is where we start off, by Archie Goodwin and Al Williamson. So a strong, distinct change from the earlier artists. Al Williamson was a fantastic artist who really knew how to capture the detail of the characters of the Star Wars heroes in a way that's both accurate and obviously immediately recognizable. But he also draws machinery and landscapes in a really engaging and sort of in a way that really draws you into the world and to the environment. He's quite good at, I guess, world building with his artwork. So the environments that we see are highly developed and highly consistent. The Bounty Hunter on Ord Mantell is a fantastically fun little story that explains a throwaway quip. A throwaway quip in The Empire Strikes Back. We encounter the actual bounty hunter that they are referring to, a cyborg bounty hunter by the name of Score. And, the usual sort of Jeopardy, it's a T-16 type vehicle or a T-16 inspired vehicle there. The usual sort of Jeopardy and close calls before obviously when you're telling stories between the main movies, everything has to be consistent with the stories. We can't have any major changes to the encounters that take place, or no one's actually going to get significantly injured or worse if they are required to show up in the movies later. After the Bounty Hunter of Ord Mantell, we move on to a story by, again, the same pairing of artists, same pair of creators, Archie Goodwin and Al Williamson, who, as I mentioned, continue the whole way through. Darth Vader Strikes. We've got this title panels that has some bearing, some relationship to the story being told, but I love these, and these sort of things, again, when I ever had spare pages of these that were collected by friends or family, that end up in scrapbooks. They were just a really strong nostalgic component. Okay, a quick camera battery change there. I hope that wasn't too much of a jump. We're going to move on to the second folder of these for those that are bearing with me as we flick through the New Zealand Women's Weekly Star Wars comics. We're just finishing off from memory. Let me see, just sneak a peek ahead. Yes, we're still looking at the Serpent Masters, story entitled The Serpent Masters. There's a couple of fun things in here, if I can find them. Again, really loving the title frames. Interesting variation on the formatting in this particular page here, and a great representation of Williamson's Stormtrooper expertise. Fantastic at drawing, hardware and vehicles, TIE fighters in particular. Proportions are always fantastic. Detail is exceptional. This was an interesting one. It was the first time we encountered Stormtrooper armor, and it really stuck with me as quite a fun concept. Stormtrooper armor being used by non-Imperials. So we see a Stormtrooper with a fur coat in addition to his armor. We jump to a few pages, no, just one in the first instance, where we are missing colour. But Al Williamson's art stands up to black and white presentation as much as it does with colour. Just a master of line work, and it works either in colour or in black and white. See another representation of Stormtrooper armour components being used by non-Imperials, which not something I thought of in advance as a child, so it really did stick with me, and it's gone on to sort of be I really am a fan of Stormtrooper variants, partly as a consequence of seeing that sort of reuse and interpretation. So we're starting to move into the zone of in a time era of The Empire Strikes Back in terms of when these were coming out. The Serpent Masters came out in October of 1981 in New Zealand, so a good few months after Empire Strikes Back had taken place, and that's reflected in some of the title panel artwork that we see emblazoning the top of these pages. Following on from the Serpent Masters, moving into 1982, in fact, is the Deadly Reunion. I love this panel. It's one that just happens to have stuck with me from my childhood. This that's showing up without too much glare. This vision of TIE bombers, slight variations from the movie versions, but still very cool, with their both double round-faced cockpits, fuselages, bombing a city. But there was something really interesting about seeing those TIE variants in action. A panel of title artwork that I just absolutely love, because this publicity shot is just a fantastic favourite of mine. I loved the promo shot, the lobby cards of the Chewbacca with a sand trooper atop. So captured wonderfully there by Williamson. Deadly Reunion, and great pick of Boba Fett with the Slave One before we move into Trader's Gambit. My name written on that one because as a family, my mother wasn't actually getting these a lot, so I relied on family members to save these for me. That's why I had one or two gaps. So that one there I've actually kept with the handwritten note from a family member since I originally got it back in the early 80s. Another fantastic panel here of promo art of Sand People. I love it. TIEs attacking the Yavin, the rebel base on Yavin's fourth moon. Fantastic example of the sort of strength that Williamson has in drawing, wide panoramic shots with lots of detail. Trader's Gambit takes us to an underwater city and into a bit of an underworld, and we have a giant squid-like beast as a encounter and the source of jeopardy for the heroes before their ultimate and eventual escape. The Night Beast was a story that really has strong memories for me. I don't know that I can necessarily explain why, but I think it's in part because it's almost entirely centered around the structures on Yavin, on the rebel base on Yavin, and kind of implying some of their backstory without going into it in explicit detail. So the essence of this story is that an Imperial attack on the Yavin base awakens something from beneath the temples that are being used as the rebel base, and that thing that is awakened is referred to as the Night Beast, as in the title of the comic strip. So a fairly straightforward story and encounter, but like I say, all set on Yavin and sort of exploring aspects, a few aspects of the rebel base that really expanded on what we knew from the movies and really felt connected to the movies, which was an important thing for the expanded universe at the time. I enjoyed both the Han Solo at Star's End type stories that moves well away from, with only a few tangential references to the movies, but I also enjoy the things that tie strongly into the movies themselves. So obviously seeing things like the rebel transport that we see in The Empire Strikes Back referenced strongly there. This story was a shade different. This story is entitled The Return of Ben Kenobi. A little bit different because the structure of the story was a little bit different. We know by this point the continuity is pretty the chronology was pretty continuous in the Goodwin Williamson story arcs, in terms of both its relationship to the movie, but it's fairly linear trajectory from story to story in many ways. So at this point in time, we know that Ben Kenobi was beaten by Darth Vader on the Death Star, so it's a really striking development that Ben Kenobi is mysteriously showing up, and Luke hears about him through the stories, the myths and legends of some locals, but eventually does encounter someone who appears to be Ben Kenobi. At the risk of giving away a bit of a spoiler, but that's going to be inevitable as I page through these, we discover that sadly it is not in fact Ben Kenobi. It is an actor recruited by Darth Vader to entice and try and capture, I guess, Luke Skywalker, but ultimately the actor portraying Ben Kenobi decides that's not a path he wants to follow. The Power Gem, a fun little diversion that doesn't really speak to any directly any events of the movies, but this mysterious power gem that has, I believe it's a power source, that has powers that are sought after by on both sides of the war, and we're trying to get our hands on it as the rebels in order to use it. I think I'll be proven right or wrong very shortly, I think to be used ultimately in another story arc. I like this droid here. It's got a few elements of a 2-1B medical droid, so even though he's a new creation, he is Williamson is drawing on a few parameters from the movie to expand out beyond the detail that we directly see in the Star Wars movies. A few black and white pages here, but as I say, I don't mind them. I don't mind Al Williamson's art rendered in monochrome line art, particularly as we move into this story entitled Ice World, which is going to really start to intersect with the movies. We've got Tauntauns in a snowstorm. Great use of simple shadow, but to really sort of convey the tempestuousness of the weather. But I love seeing Tauntauns again. And as I said even early on in the very early Manning comics, seeing Tusken Raiders and Jawas, I love just seeing all the aspects of the movies drawn into these comics and represented in new and interesting ways. The final panel of Ice World teases. So this Ice World concluded in, let me see, February 1983. Teases a new character, Admiral Akbar, who's going to appear in the next film of the Star Wars saga, Revenge of the Jedi, which, as we all know, was renamed Return of the Jedi. But a lot of promo material. We knew that by the time that comic came out in New Zealand. But or did we? Let me just check. No, I tell a lie. That's February 1983. So we were still a little bit of a stretch away from the release of the Return of the Jedi in New Zealand. But we're moving into a story arc that is building up to Return of the Jedi. Or at least prior to the events of, we still see Han Solo, but introducing characters that will ultimately show up in Return of the Jedi, specifically Admiral Akbar and other Mon Calamari. Cool representation of Stormtrooper variants, AT-AT drivers there being used to drive Imperial tanks. So just to get my story straight, this is all taking place, looking at it prior, even though we've got Admiral Akbar, it's taking place prior to the events of The Empire Strikes Back. Fantastic Williamson Stormtroopers, some very cool Imperial hardware, these new vehicles, these tanks, even though they're brightly coloured there, they are shown later in Imperial Grey and they feel like they really fit in at the time with the likes of AT-ATs and ATSTs in terms of hardware design. Okay. This story is entitled Doom Mission. It came out in April of 1983, 12 pages long. So we saw a few stories that were condensed down into 8 pages. We've had a little bit of variety in amongst them, a few in the 9 or 10 page range. Doom Mission and the next few stories are all 12 pages, so we've got a little bit more opportunity to really develop the content, the stories, and just enjoy moving around within the Star Wars universe. Now, this is in fact the use of the power gem that we saw a few stories back, being used as a shield disruptor from memory on the nose of a fighter. Feels the tail end of that feels a little bit Battlestar Galactica Vipery. Very cool representation of Luke Skywalker in what is more closely a snowspeeder pilot get up than an X-Wing pilot. with a heavily interpreted blaster there. And again, I won't go into the stories in too much detail. We do take a look at them more closely on the SWNZ website. There'll be links down below of this video if you want to take a closer look at, you know, some scans of some of these pages and a closer look at some of these stories. We're continually adding to that. And we draw a little closer to the end of this folder here. Do mission moves into race for survival, and we've really settled into the Al Williamson artwork solidly here. And let's see what we got coming up. Again, I love the title panels. I'm not 100% sure who was responsible for the colouring, and I don't know that they necessarily had a lot to do with the original artist, because we see some really strongly interpreted colouring. Everyone knows that C-3PO was shiny metallic gold, but we see Max Rebo in a green here, and we see that sort of colour interpretation show up from time to time. Jabba the Hutt and the title panel. Nice version. Random non-canon alien off to his side. Okay, love this scene, this whole sort of promo scene. And still in the closing pages of Race for Survival from memory. Let me just check. Yep. And this is a page that again really stuck with me. These adjacent panels that both had these strong Return of the Jedi features really spoke to me at the time. I love the Royal Guard, but also this derelict Lambda class shuttle. Found just fascinating as a kid seeing references to the movies but used in a really expanded way like that. Flashback to the Night Beast of Yavin 4, but that's in fact just a vision that's being used as a weapon. Oops, missed on that. Okay. And back to quite a few pages in black and white. Paradise Detour moves into a story called A New Beginning. As I've been paging through, you might notice the backs of the pages, which I've left exposed, just so we've got one page per folder sleeve. And that's just because it's kind of fun to recall the context and to remember that both the age that these were printed in and the magazine and the context they were printed in. There's a few fun oddities that show up on the backs of these pages, as well as looking at the main features. Some cool artwork in this black and white one, including Squidhead, Tessic and Bib Fortuna, Jabba's Palace, flying lizards outside. That speaks back to Williamson's Serpent Masters in a story earlier on. Jabba the Hutt, Boba Fett involved in this story. Not part of the story itself, but as I keep saying over and over, I love Williamson's artwork, particularly when it relates to sort of his renditions of promo images. So seeing Tauntauns and probe droids, fantastically engaging as a kid and even now. So this is a story from memory about continuing to investigate the viability of Hoth as a base. Only a few pages left as we wrap up A New Beginning. A story called Showdown sees the return of Score, the infamous bounty hunter of Ord Mantell. Boba Fett in the bottom edge of this panel here. Scored Dengar. Really cool to see. Characters drawn back in from earlier stories, but also from the movies. A little bit of that funny colouring that we referred to there in terms of interpreting how Dengar should be coloured. Now, each week would see either the continued next week printed on the bottom of the page that came from the New Zealand Women's Weekly itself, or if it was from story to story, would see an introduction to the title of the new story. This story here, Showdown, had a slightly shorter run than the 12 pages runs of the immediately preceding stories. We didn't really know at the time how long to expect things to go for. Showdown, I get this over here, flipping over, ran for a mere 6 pages. And moved into a story called The Final Trap, which ran for a mere 5 pages. We're still seeing it continued next week. And then, sadly, without any warning, 7th of May 1984, page number 262, abruptly wraps up The Final Trap. The page does not say continued next week. And that was the end of the run of Star Wars comics in the New Zealand Women's Weekly. Nearly 5 years, 262 pages, lots and lots of new characters, lots of new scenes, settings, planets, references to new material and old material, and all in all a wonderful sort of, not quite freebie, but from the kids that were reading them point of view, basically a freebie Star Wars material on a weekly basis that just any kid that saw the movies in the theatres at the time they came out will be familiar with these on some level and likely have memories of these, and they're very strong and important to me. So I hope you enjoyed this little bit of a rambling reminisce going through my collection of New Zealand Women's Weekly comics, a key and fascinating part of New Zealand's Star Wars history. We'll be taking a look at other New Zealand Star Wars collectibles here on the SWNZ YouTube channel very shortly, so thank you for listening in to this meandering, nostalgic look back. We'll be doing similar things with other New Zealand Star Wars collectibles on the channel. If you enjoyed this experience, give us a like, give it a share in your favourite Star Wars group, and subscribe for notifications for any of our upcoming looks at New Zealand Star Wars collectibles. Thank you for watching.
If you enjoyed this video, go ahead and give it a like, check out our other videos, and subscribe for alerts about new uploads. Thanks for watching, and may the Force be with you.